Marcus Chen had built his restaurant empire from nothing, starting with a single food truck in Portland and expanding to 15 upscale establishments across the Pacific Northwest. But tonight he was mopping floors at his flagship location in downtown Seattle, and nobody knew who he really was. He'd shown up 3 weeks ago, claiming to be a new hire named Mark, wearing second-hand jeans and a faded company polo, and management had put him on the closing shift washing dishes and cleaning up after the dinner rush ended at 11. The undercover assignment was his way of seeing what really happened when the corporate boss wasn't around, when the polished smiles dropped and the real culture of his restaurants revealed itself, and what he'd discovered so far had been mostly unremarkable until tonight when everything changed. It was 11:45 on a Thursday and Marcus was pushing his mop bucket past the dry storage room when he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks, a sound so quiet he almost missed it, the unmistakable sound of someone crying while trying desperately not to be heard. He set the mop against the wall and moved closer to the storage room door, which was pulled almost shut but not quite latched, and through the gap he could see movement in the darkness, a figure hunched on the floor between shelves stacked with industrial-sized cans and bags of rice. His first instinct was to announce himself, to ask if someone needed help, but something made him hesitate, made him simply observe instead, and what he saw in those next few seconds would haunt him for weeks. It was Sarah Winters, the 23-year-old waitress who'd been working the floor that night, still in her black uniform with her name tag slightly crooked, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, with a plastic to-go container balanced on her lap. She was eating leftover pasta from the dinner service, the kind of high-end dish that sold for $38 on the menu, but she wasn't savoring it the way customers did in the dining room. She was eating it with the desperate efficiency of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, tears streaming down her face as she chewed. Marcus felt something twist in his chest as he watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, then take another bite, then cry harder, the weight of whatever burden she carried written in every line of her exhausted body. He'd reviewed her file earlier that week as part of his investigation, knew she'd been with the company for 8 months, knew she had excellent performance reviews and near-perfect attendance, knew she picked up extra shifts whenever they were available, but the file hadn't told him that one of his employees was hiding in a storage room eating scraps because she was hungry. The restaurant industry was brutal. He knew that better than anyone. But this was different. This was something that cut through all his business metrics and profit margins, and reminded him why he'd started cooking in the first place, because food was supposed to bring people together, supposed to nourish and comfort, not become a luxury that his own staff couldn't afford. Sarah finished the pasta and carefully sealed the container, then used her apron to wipe her face, composing herself with visible effort before standing up, and Marcus quickly backed away from the door, retreating to his mop bucket before she could discover him watching. His mind was racing with questions that demanded answers, questions about wages and scheduling and the gap between what he thought his restaurants were and what they actually meant to the people who worked there. But more immediately he was thinking about Sarah Winters and what desperation looked like when it wore a name tag and smiled at customers who left 20% tips on $100 bills. The next morning Marcus called an emergency meeting with his executive team, but he didn't mention what he'd seen in the storage room, didn't tell them about Sarah eating leftovers on the floor, because he'd learned over the years that real change required understanding the complete picture, and right now he only had one devastating piece of a much larger puzzle. Marcus spent the entire weekend diving into payroll records, scheduling data, and cost of living calculations that painted a picture he'd been deliberately avoiding for too long, numbers that looked acceptable on spreadsheets, but translated to impossible choices for the people who actually lived them. Sarah Winters made $14 an hour plus tips, which sounded reasonable until he factored in that she was part-time, meaning no benefits, no health insurance, and an average of 28 hours per week that added up to roughly $1,600 a month before taxes. He pulled up rental listings for Seattle and felt his stomach drop as he scrolled through pages of studios, starting at $1,800, one-bedroom apartments at $2,200, rooms in shared houses at $1,000, if you were lucky and didn't mind living with strangers who might steal your food from the communal refrigerator. The math was simple and brutal. Sarah was working for one of the most successful restaurant groups in the region and couldn't afford to live within 30 miles of the place that employed her, couldn't afford to eat the food she served, couldn't afford to get sick or have an emergency or do anything except work and survive. He expanded his investigation to include the entire staff at the flagship location, and what he found was a pattern of quiet desperation that his management team had either ignored or never bothered to notice. Servers picking up doubles and triples until they were dead on their feet, kitchen staff working split shifts that destroyed any possibility of a normal life, people trading shifts in elaborate arrangements because taking a day off meant not making rent. The tip pooling system he'd implemented to ensure fairness was actually hurting the strongest performers, and the scheduling software that was supposed to optimize labor costs was creating unpredictable hours that made it impossible for anyone to plan their lives or take a second job. Marcus had always considered himself a good employer, had always paid above minimum wage and created what he thought was a positive work environment, but the data was showing him something different, showing him that good intentions and competitive wages didn't matter when the entire economic system was rigged against people trying to build stable lives on service industry income. He went back to the restaurant on Monday, still playing his role as Mark the dishwasher, watching Sarah work the lunch shift with fresh eyes that saw details he'd missed before. The way she smiled at customers while her eyes remained tired, the way she moved with practiced efficiency that came from never having the luxury of wasting motion, the way she checked her phone during her break with an expression that suggested bad news was more common than good. During the afternoon lull, he found himself working near her station, wiping down tables while she refilled salt shakers, and he took a chance on starting a conversation that felt both necessary and invasive. He asked how long she'd been in Seattle, just casual small talk between co-workers, and she told him she'd moved from Spokane after her mom got sick, needed to be closer to the specialists at University of Washington Medical Center, and Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. She was supporting her mother, paying for an apartment close enough to visit the hospital regularly, trying to cover medical bills that insurance didn't touch, doing all of this on wages that barely covered rent for one person, let alone two. He wanted to reveal himself right then, wanted to tell her who he was and that he'd fix everything, but he held back because he knew that kind of impulse was about making himself feel better, not about actually solving the systemic problems that had created this situation. That night after closing, he stayed late again, not hiding this time but sitting at the bar with Tom Rivera, the general manager who'd been running the flagship location for 4 years, and he asked questions that made Tom increasingly uncomfortable about turnover rates, employee satisfaction, and whether anyone on the management team had any idea what their staff was actually going through. Tom defended the operation at first, citing industry standards and competitive compensation, but Marcus pushed harder, asked if Tom knew where his employees lived, how they got to work, whether they could afford to eat, and watched the manager's confident expression gradually crumble into something like shame. Sarah's phone rang at 2 in the morning on Tuesday, the kind of call that never brought good news, and she jerked awake in the studio apartment she could barely afford, heart already racing. Before she even saw the hospital's number on the screen, her mother had taken a turn. The nurse explained in that professional, compassionate voice they all learned in training, nothing immediately life-threatening, but they needed to adjust medications, and the doctor wanted to see family in the morning to discuss next steps, which was medical speak for more tests, more treatment, more bills that would stack up like accusations of inadequacy. She sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, doing math in her head that never quite added up, calculating shifts and tips and the growing credit card balance that haunted her dreams, knowing she was already behind on utilities and that her car was making a noise that probably meant expensive repairs she couldn't afford. The morning meeting at the hospital confirmed what she'd been dreading. Her mother needed a different medication that insurance wouldn't cover, something about it being too new or too expensive or too something that translated to $400 a month out of pocket, and Sarah said yes, of course, whatever she needs, while her mind screamed about how impossible that was going to be. She went straight to the restaurant from the hospital, arriving early for her lunch shift, and stood in the employee bathroom splashing cold water on her face, trying to wash away the exhaustion and fear and make herself look like someone who belonged in an upscale dining room serving wine that cost more than her daily wage. The shift was brutal in the way that service shifts could be when you were running on no sleep and too much anxiety, customers who wanted modifications and complained about wait times and left passive-aggressive tips that felt like moral judgment. Her feet aching in the non-slip shoes that needed replacing, her smile feeling like a mask that kept threatening to crack. During her break, she sat in her car. The same storage room felt too risky after last week, and searched for second jobs on her phone, scrolling through listings for overnight stocking at grocery stores, weekend shifts at call centers, anything that could fill the gap between what she earned and what she needed. The problem was timing. Her restaurant schedule was erratic enough that most places wouldn't hire someone who couldn't commit to consistent availability, and the few options that remained were far enough away that transportation costs would eat up any extra income. She was trapped in the classic service industry catch-22, too broke to quit, too exhausted to find something better, running faster and faster just to stay in the same desperate place. That evening she picked up a double, working straight through from lunch to closing, and by 10 o'clock she was moving on autopilot, her body going through motions while her mind drifted to dark places where problems had no solutions and effort meant nothing. She was clearing table 7 when she stumbled, just a momentary loss of balance from fatigue, but the tray tipped and the wine glass crashed to the floor, the sound cutting through the dining room's ambient conversation like a gunshot. Her face burned with humiliation as other servers rushed to help clean up, as customers turned to stare, as Tom the manager approached with an expression that tried for understanding but landed somewhere near disappointed, and she mumbled apologies while fighting back tears that had nothing to do with a broken glass, and everything to do with systems that broke people. After closing, she was sweeping the dining room when Tom called her into the office, and her exhausted brain immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios, convinced she was about to be fired for that one mistake, for being too tired, for not being good enough at pretending everything was fine. Instead, Tom asked if she was okay, if something was going on, and the genuine concern in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been, because it forced her to acknowledge that her struggle was visible, that her carefully maintained facade was crumbling, that she was failing at the basic task of appearing professional while her life fell apart. She told him about her mother in vague terms, tried to downplay the financial pressure, and Tom listened with the expression of someone who wanted to help but didn't know how, who understood the restaurant industry paid what it paid, and operated on margins too thin for grand gestures of generosity. Marcus was wiping down the kitchen line when Tom emerged from his office, looking shaken, and the manager didn't notice him standing there as he pulled out his phone and made a call that Marcus absolutely should not have eavesdropped on, but did anyway, listening as Tom spoke to someone about Sarah, about employee assistance programs that didn't really exist, about whether there was any flexibility in the labor budget for raises or additional hours. The conversation didn't last long and ended with Tom sounding defeated, thanking whoever was on the other end, and hanging up with the air of someone who'd just confirmed that certain problems were too big for individual managers to solve. Marcus finished his cleaning duties and clocked out, but instead of leaving, he lingered in the dining room where Sarah was finishing her closing side work, organizing menus and refilling condiments with mechanical precision that spoke to muscle memory developed over countless closing shifts. He approached her carefully, still in character as Mark the dishwasher, and asked if she was all right, referencing the broken glass earlier, and she gave him a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she was fine, just a long day. He pushed gently, told her he'd been in the industry for years and recognized burnout when he saw it, and something about his tone, about talking to another service worker instead of management, made her defenses crack just slightly. She didn't give him details, didn't mention her mother or medical bills or the impossible math of survival, but she admitted she was working a lot, that money was tight, that Seattle was expensive, and sometimes she wondered why she bothered trying, and Marcus heard the exhaustion in her voice that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of weariness that came from fighting a battle you couldn't win. He wanted to tell her right then, wanted to drop the disguise and promise he'd fix everything, but he recognized that impulse as ego, as the desire to be a savior, rather than address the systemic failures that had created this situation, and he forced himself to stay in character, to simply listen and offer the solidarity of someone who supposedly understood because he was living the same struggle. They talked for 20 minutes in that empty dining room, 2 service workers at the end of a long shift, and Sarah told him things she probably wouldn't have shared with management, about customer abuse that went unaddressed, about scheduling software that felt designed to make life difficult, about the constant pressure to smile and perform gratitude while working for wages that didn't cover basic needs. Marcus absorbed every word, every complaint, every casual mention of problems that his executive team had either ignored or never bothered to investigate. He felt a growing sense of responsibility that went beyond just Sarah, that extended to every person working in his restaurants who was struggling silently, while he collected profits and congratulated himself on being a good employer. When Sarah finally left, heading out into the Seattle night to catch a bus because she couldn't afford parking downtown, Marcus sat alone in the dining room he'd designed to feel elegant and welcoming, and saw it differently now. Saw it as a machine that extracted labor from desperate people and converted their exhaustion into revenue that he'd been too comfortable to question. He pulled out his personal phone, the expensive one he kept hidden while playing Mark the dishwasher, and started making notes not about individual acts of charity, but about structural changes, about wage scales and benefits packages and scheduling systems, about what it would actually cost to ensure that nobody working for his company had to choose between eating and paying rent. The numbers were substantial but not impossible, would require sacrificing some profit margin and potentially raising prices, but as he sat there in the dim security lighting, he realized he'd been optimizing for the wrong metric. He'd been so focused on growth and expansion that he'd lost sight of the human cost that funded his success. His phone buzzed with an email from his CFO, quarterly projections that showed another record-breaking period, and he felt sick looking at those numbers. Profits built partially on the backs of people like Sarah, who were eating leftovers in storage rooms because they couldn't afford the food they served. Marcus called an executive meeting for Wednesday morning, 7 a.m. sharp, and showed up as himself for the first time in 3 weeks, watching his leadership team's confused expressions as he walked into the conference room in a suit instead of dishwashing clothes. He didn't waste time on explanations or apologies, just launched into a presentation that laid out everything he'd observed during his undercover investigation, every systemic failure, every policy that optimized profit at the expense of people, every management blind spot that allowed suffering to flourish in the shadows of their success. He started with Sarah, told them about the storage room and the leftover pasta, and watched their faces shift from surprise to discomfort to something resembling shame, and then he expanded the scope, showed them data about staff turnover, about how many employees worked second jobs, about the gap between Seattle's cost of living and what they actually paid, about the hidden costs of their labor practices that included broken people and broken families, and a workplace culture that demanded performance while providing inadequate support. His CFO interrupted first, defending their compensation structure by citing industry standards and competitive analysis, and Marcus cut her off with numbers that told a different story, showed that industry standards were a race to the bottom, that being competitive with other restaurants that also underpaid their staff was not the ethical victory she seemed to think it was. He laid out a new proposal that would fundamentally restructure how they approached compensation, starting with raising base wages for all hourly employees to $22, implementing guaranteed minimum hours for anyone who wanted full-time status, providing real health insurance that didn't come with deductibles that cost more than people earn, and revamping the scheduling system to prioritize stability over algorithmic efficiency. The room erupted in objections about costs and feasibility, about profit margins and investor expectation. Marcus let them talk themselves out before responding with cold clarity that this wasn't a negotiation, that these changes were happening whether they liked it or not, that if they couldn't figure out how to run profitable restaurants while paying people enough to live, then they had no business calling themselves leaders. He knew he was burning bridges with some of his executive team. Some of them would quit, rather than implement changes that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how the industry worked. But he'd spent 3 weeks mopping floors and watching desperate people pretend everything was fine, and he no longer had patience for business school theories that ignored human dignity. His director of operations pointed out that raising wages would require increasing menu prices, that their upscale clientele might balk at paying $45 for pasta instead of $30, and Marcus responded that if their customers couldn't afford an extra $7 to ensure the staff wasn't eating leftovers in storage rooms, then those customers could go somewhere else. The meeting lasted 3 hours and ended with a mix of reluctant acceptance and barely concealed resentment, and Marcus knew he'd created enemies in his own organization, knew that some of his executive team would spend the next few months trying to undermine his reforms or prove they were economically unfeasible, but he'd made his decision and there was no going back. He spent the afternoon with his HR director drafting new policies, creating implementation timelines, figuring out how to roll out changes across all 15 locations without creating chaos or giving competitors an opening to poach customers who might be price sensitive. They decided to start with the flagship location as a pilot program, would monitor results for 60 days before expanding to other restaurants, and Marcus insisted on personally announcing the changes to the staff, wanted to face the people who'd been affected by his old policies, and explain what was changing and why. That evening he went back to the restaurant early, arriving before the dinner shift started, and asked Tom to gather the entire staff for a meeting, the rare kind of all hands where everyone from sous chefs to bussers stood together in the dining room wondering what announcement was coming. Sarah stood near the back of the gathered staff, still in her street clothes because she'd arrived early for her shift, and watched with confusion as Tom introduced their owner, Marcus Chen, a man she'd never met despite working at his restaurant for 8 months, a wealthy figure who existed in company emails and corporate mythology, but never materialized in the actual workplace. Marcus looked nervous in a way that seemed wrong for someone so successful, kept adjusting his tie and clearing his throat, and when he started talking his voice carried an emotional weight that immediately grabbed everyone's attention, made the casual conversations die out and the room fall silent. He told them he'd been working undercover for 3 weeks as a dishwasher named Ma, and Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the quiet guy who'd talked to her in the dining room 2 nights ago wasn't a fellow struggling worker, but the owner who'd been secretly observing them, and her first emotion was betrayal, was anger at being studied like a specimen. But then Marcus kept talking and the anger shifted into something more complicated. He told them what he'd seen, didn't name Sarah specifically, but referenced finding an employee eating leftovers because they couldn't afford food, and Sarah's face burned with humiliation as she realized everyone would know he was talking about her. But Marcus framed it differently than she expected, didn't present it as her failure, but as his, as a damning indictment of the system he'd created. He said the words that service workers almost never heard from ownership, said he'd been wrong, said the company had been failing its employees, said that competitive wages and industry standards were meaningless phrases that disguised the reality of people working full-time for restaurants that profited from their desperation. The room was dead silent now, everyone processing this surreal moment of a wealthy owner, admitting fault, confessing to structural failures, promising change in ways that seemed too good to be true, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for the catch, for the inevitable but that would reveal this was all performative corporate theater. Instead, Marcus laid out concrete change, specific numbers and policies that sounded almost fantastical in their generosity: $22 an hour base wage, guaranteed full-time status for anyone who wanted it, real health insurance starting immediately, scheduling software that prioritized worker stability over cost optimization. And Sarah felt tears starting because these weren't abstract promises, but solutions to the exact problems that had been crushing her. He talked about raising menu prices to cover the increased labor costs, about how customers who couldn't afford to support living wages for staff probably shouldn't be eating at upscale restaurants, and Sarah heard several people laugh in shocked disbelief, because nobody talked like this. No owner ever acknowledged that their business model depended on exploitation. Marcus opened the floor for questions and the room erupted, people asking about implementation timelines and whether this applied to all locations and what happened to staff who were already at or above $22. And he answered everything with patience and specificity that suggested he'd actually thought this through, rather than making grand gestures he'd never follow through on. Someone asked why he'd gone undercover instead of just conducting surveys or talking to management, and Marcus's response was brutally honest, said he'd learned that people told executives what they wanted to hear, that the only way to see the truth was to experience it himself, and while his methods might have been questionable, the data had been undeniable. Sarah found herself raising her hand, almost involuntarily, and when Marcus called on her, she asked the question that everyone was probably thinking but nobody wanted to voice, asked what happened if the pilot program failed, if customers revolted against higher prices, if the numbers didn't work and they all ended up unemployed when the restaurant closed. Marcus looked directly at her, when he answered, seemed to recognize her even though they'd only talked once in that dining room, and he said that failure was possible but so was success, that every major change involved risk, but the alternative was continuing a system that ground people down until they broke, and he'd rather fail trying to do better than succeed by maintaining an unjust status quo. The changes rolled out over the following 2 weeks, with efficiency that suggested Marcus had been planning implementation even before announcing to staff, payroll systems updated to reflect new wages, scheduling software reconfigured to prioritize consistent hours, health insurance enrollment sessions held during paid time with HR representatives who actually answered questions instead of deflecting. Sarah's first paycheck under the new system arrived on Friday, and she sat in her car in the parking lot staring at the direct deposit notification on her phone, at numbers that were nearly 60% higher than her previous checks, and she cried for the second time in that car but for completely different reasons than before. The $22 hourly rate combined with guaranteed 35 hours per week translated to over $3,000 a month before tips, which meant she could cover rent and utilities and groceries, and her mother's new medication without juggling credit cards or choosing which bills to pay late, meant she could start paying down debt instead of watching it grow, meant she could breathe without the constant weight of financial panic crushing her chest. She picked up her mother from a medical appointment that afternoon and told her about the changes, and her mom cried too, said she'd been carrying guilt about being a burden, about watching Sarah work herself into exhaustion, and Sarah realized that the impact of poverty rippled outward in ways she'd never fully articulated, that her struggle had been poisoning both their lives with stress that neither of them deserved. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted noticeably in those first weeks. Staff who'd been running on empty suddenly had energy for conversations during shift changes, for laughing at stupid jokes instead of just grimly pushing through their tasks, for actually caring about the quality of their work instead of doing bare minimum to survive. Sarah found herself engaging with customers differently now, not just performing friendliness, but genuinely enjoying interactions, recommending menu items with authentic enthusiasm instead of strategic upselling, and her tips actually increased as guests responded to the change in energy. The raised menu prices that Marcus had warned about did cause some customer complaints, people who felt entitled to demand justification for $7 increases, and Sarah discovered she had no patience for that particular brand of entitlement anymore. Would politely explain that the higher prices ensured staff earned living wages and watch customers decide whether their principles were stronger than their desire for affordable luxury. Most customers accepted the changes without comment. Some even specifically mentioned appreciating the restaurant's commitment to fair wages, and the few who complained loudly about not being able to afford their usual weekly dinners generally revealed themselves as people who probably shouldn't have been spending hundreds of dollars on restaurants anyway if $7 was a deal breaker. Marcus maintained a visible presence in those first weeks, not micromanaging but checking in, asking staff for feedback on what was working and what needed adjustment. And Sarah noticed he'd changed too, seemed less polished and more present, like the Undercover experience had stripped away some corporate veneer and left someone more human underneath. She worked up the courage to approach him during a slow Tuesday lunch shift, thanked him directly for the changes, and he surprised her by apologizing for the undercover surveillance, said he'd been wrestling with the ethics of observing her without consent, and Sarah found herself forgiving him because the results spoke louder than the methods. They talked for a few minutes about her mother's treatment, about how the health insurance had already made a difference in accessing better care, and Marcus asked questions that seemed genuinely interested rather than performatively concerned. Sarah realized that whatever combination of guilt and revelation and actual human decency had motivated his changes, the outcome was transforming lives in ways that transcended his motivations. The other restaurants in the company rolled out similar changes over the following month, each location adapting the model with local modifications, and while Marcus faced pressure from investors who didn't understand why he was sacrificing profit margin for worker welfare, he held firm on the principle that restaurants existed to nourish people and that included the people doing the work. 6 months after Marcus's announcement, Sarah stood in the dining room during a busy Saturday night service, and the contrast with her previous life felt almost surreal, like remembering a nightmare from the safety of waking up. She'd been promoted to shift lead with a raise to $26 an hour, had moved to a better apartment closer to the hospital, had enrolled in community college classes that her new schedule actually allowed time for, and most importantly, had watched her mother's health stabilize with access to proper treatment and medications that were no longer impossible financial choices. The restaurant was thriving in ways that defied the dire predictions that skeptics had made, revenue actually up, despite the higher prices, because word had spread about Marcus's reforms, because people wanted to support businesses that treated workers with dignity, because the energy of a staff that wasn't ground down by desperation translated into better service and better food and better experiences. Marcus had become something of a reluctant celebrity in restaurant industry circles, giving interviews about the changes and facing backlash from other owners who claimed his model was unsustainable, who insisted that paying living wages would destroy the industry, who seemed personally offended by the suggestion that maybe restaurants built on worker exploitation deserved to fail. He pushed back against that narrative with data from his own locations, showing that investing in staff reduced turnover, improved performance, attracted better talent, and created workplace cultures where people actually gave a damn about outcomes. And while some industry leaders dismissed him as naive or privileged, others started quietly implementing similar changes in their own businesses. Sarah had become an unofficial spokesperson for the transformed workplace, had done interviews with local media about what the changes meant for her life, and she tried to communicate the psychological impact that went beyond just the financial security, the way that feeling valued changed everything about how you approached work and life, the way that dignity was not a luxury, but a fundamental human need that previous service industry standards had treated as expendable. She'd connected with other restaurant workers across the city, had helped form an informal network that shared information about which establishments treated staff well, and which ones perpetuated the old exploitative models, and she'd watched with satisfaction as several notoriously bad restaurants struggled to hire anyone, because word traveled fast in the service community. The changes hadn't solved everything. Sarah's life still had challenges, and her mother's illness still required ongoing management, and she still got tired from long shifts. But the difference was fundamental. She was tired from work rather than from the impossible task of trying to survive on inadequate wages. Tired in a way that sleep could actually fix rather than the bone-deep exhaustion that came from systems designed to break you. On this particular Saturday night, as she coordinated her section and helped train a new server who'd just been hired at the new base, Sarah caught Marcus's eye across the dining room, and they exchanged a nod of mutual respect, owner and employee, but also two people who'd been part of a transformation that neither of them had fully anticipated. She thought about that night 6 months ago when she'd been eating leftovers on a storage room floor, thought about how close she'd been to breaking completely, and felt grateful not just for the changes but for the fact that someone with power had actually chosen to use it differently. The evening rush continued, and Sarah moved through her section with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering food and managing the complex dance of upscale service. But now she was doing it as someone who could afford to eat that same food, who had health insurance and stable housing, and the possibility of a future that extended beyond just survival, and the difference was everything. The restaurant hummed with the energy of people who were valued, who were paid fair, who could afford to care about their work because their work allowed them to afford their lives. And in that busy dining room on a Saturday night in Seattle, the radical idea that treating workers like human beings could actually work was proving itself one shift at a time.